What happens when a seasoned Republican senator thinks he can bulldoze a young progressive and gets absolutely demolished instead? Tim Scott thought he had an easy target, a rising Democratic socialist from New York who he could publicly humiliate to score political points with his base. Instead, he got schooled so hard that the entire room fell silent. Conservative media scrambled to spin the disaster, and Scott himself looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor dot by the end of this video. You'll see how one perfectly crafted response not only destroyed Scott's attack, but exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of his entire political brand. And trust me, you'll want to see this clapback that left a U.S. senator completely speechless. But first, let me set the scene for what became one of the most brutal political takedowns in recent memory. Picture this: a packed Senate committee, hearing room, C-SPAN cameras rolling, political junkies across America tuning in, and two men sitting across from each other, representing completely different visions of America's future. On one side, Tim Scott, Republican senator from South Carolina, a rising star in conservative politics, known for his smooth delivery and his ability to articulate Republican talking points with passion and conviction. Scott had built his career on the idea that America is a land of opportunity where anyone can succeed through hard work and determination. On the other side, Zohran Mamdani, New York State Assembly member and unapologetic Democratic socialist. Born in Uganda, raised in New York, Mamdani had quickly gained attention for his sharp intellect, his unwillingness to back down from fights, and his ability to articulate progressive positions in ways that cut through political noise. This wasn't supposed to be a fair fight. Scott, with decades of political experience and a national platform, had specifically requested that Mamdani be called as a witness to a hearing on economic opportunity in America. The topic was right in Scott's wheelhouse and seemingly designed to make Mamdani look like an out-of-touch radical. For Scott, this was about more than just one hearing. He was positioning himself as a potential presidential candidate, and taking down a prominent Democratic socialist would be a perfect way to energize conservative voters and donors. For Mamdani, this was dangerous territory. One wrong word, one moment of looking unprepared or extreme, and his political career could be over. The conservative media machine was ready to pounce on any mistake. Neither man knew it yet, but this hearing was about to produce one of the most devastating political moments of the year, and it wouldn't go the way anyone expected. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Scott's team had done their homework. They'd studied Mamdani's speeches, his voting record, his social media posts. They'd identified what they saw as his weaknesses, his support for policies they could paint as radical, his criticism of American capitalism, his willingness to use strong language about inequality. The plan was simple but effective: get Mamdani to defend positions that would sound extreme to mainstream voters, force him to either back down from his principles or double down in ways that would make him look like a radical conservative. Media outlets had been primed for weeks: Fox News, talk radio, right-wing websites. They were all ready to amplify whatever clips came out of Scott's questioning. The narrative was already written: radical socialist exposed by common sense conservative. When the hearing began, Scott started with what seemed like softball questions about economic opportunity, but anyone watching closely could see he was setting traps, questions designed to make Mamdani sound like he was against success, against hard work, against the American dream itself. For the first 30 minutes, Mamdani answered carefully. He acknowledged the importance of individual effort while pointing to systemic barriers. He praised entrepreneurs while criticizing exploitative business practices. He was walking a tightrope, trying not to give Scott the sound bites he was looking for, but Scott was getting frustrated. Mamdani wasn't taking the bait. The young assemblyman was too disciplined, too careful. Scott needed to provoke him into saying something that could be used against him. So Scott decided to get personal. He started questioning Mamdani's background, his education, his right to criticize American economic systems. The questions became more pointed, more aggressive, more designed to provoke an emotional response. Finally, Scott thought he saw his opening. He prepared to launch what he clearly thought would be a devastating attack, one that would expose Mamdani as a hypocrite and destroy his credibility once and for all. Little did he know, he was about to walk into one of the most perfectly executed political traps in recent memory. You could see the confidence in Tim Scott's body language as he leaned forward, looked directly at Mamdani, and prepared to deliver what he clearly thought would be a knockout blow. "Mr. Mamdani," Scott said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you've spent a lot of time today criticizing American businesses and American success stories. But I have to ask you something." Scott paused for effect, making sure the cameras caught his serious expression. "You grew up in one of the most expensive areas of New York. You went to elite schools. You've benefited from the very system you now attack. Isn't there something deeply hypocritical about someone with your privileged background lecturing working Americans about inequality?" Scott sat back with what could only be described as a smirk. He clearly thought he'd delivered a devastating blow. Around the room, Republican staff members were already reaching for their phones, ready to clip and share what they assumed would be Mamdani's stammering, defensive response. But Mamdani didn't stammer. He didn't get defensive. Instead, he paused. Just for a moment, just long enough for everyone in the room to lean forward, wondering how he would respond to such a personal attack. When Mamdani finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. But there was something in his tone, a sharpness, a precision, that suggested Scott had made a terrible miscalculation. "Senator Scott," Mamdani began, "that's a fascinating question. And I think it reveals more about your worldview than it does about mine." You could feel the tension in the room shifting. This wasn't going to be the defensive response Scott had expected. Something else was happening here. Mamdani looked directly at Scott, his voice still calm but gaining strength. "You ask about hypocrisy, Senator? So let me ask you something in return. You've spent your entire career telling Americans that if they just work hard enough, they can achieve anything. That poverty is a choice. That systemic barriers don't exist. That's been your brand, hasn't it?" Scott shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't where he'd expected the conversation to go. He had asked about Mamdani's background, not opened himself up to questioning. "But here's what's interesting, Senator. You grew up in poverty in South Carolina, single mother, struggled to make ends meet, and yet somehow you've managed to convince yourself and try to convince others that your success happened in a vacuum." Everyone in the room was now completely focused on Mamdani. Even the Republicans who had come to watch Scott demolish him were hanging on every word. "Let me tell you what really happened to you, Senator. You were lifted up by government programs, Head Start, Pell Grants, affirmative action policies. You benefited from decades of civil rights activism that opened doors for you. You had mentors who saw potential in you and invested in your future." Scott's expression was changing. The confident smirk was gone. He was starting to realize where this was heading, and he didn't like it. "And now," Mamdani continued, his voice gaining power, "you sit in the United States Senate, making $174,000 a year plus benefits, with a platform that reaches millions of Americans, and you use that platform to tell poor kids that they just need to work harder." The room had gone completely silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not a whisper. Everyone was waiting for what came next. Mamdani leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Scott's face. "So if we're talking about hypocrisy, Senator, let me be clear. I've been privileged, and I use that privilege to fight for people who don't have it. you've been lifted up by the very programs you now vote to cut, and you use your platform to pull the ladder up behind you. That, Mamdani said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the room, is what real hypocrisy looks like. Tim Scott, the man who had confidently launched this attack just minutes earlier, sat completely silent, his mouth open slightly as if he was going to respond, but no words came out. The committee chairman, clearly sensing disaster, quickly moved to recess the hearing. But it was too late. The damage was done. The cameras had captured every second of Scott's humiliation. In the gallery, you could see people pulling out their phones. Staff members were frantically taking notes. Political reporters were already drafting their stories in their heads. Scott's body language told the entire story. He had slumped back in his chair. His confident posture was gone. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, Mamdani sat calmly, having delivered one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent memory, without raising his voice, without losing his composure, without stooping to personal attacks. In the space of about 2 minutes, the entire power dynamic in the room had shifted. Scott, who had come in as the aggressor, the experienced politician ready to embarrass a young upstart, had been completely outmaneuvered. Within minutes of the hearing ending, social media exploded. The clip of Mamdani's response was everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. Hashtag Tim Scott Speechless started trending within an hour. The numbers were staggering. Within 24 hours, the clip had been viewed over 20 million times across all platforms. Within a week, that number had grown to over 100 million. It became one of the most watched political clips of the year. Conservative media outlets, who had been primed to amplify Scott's attack on Mamdani, found themselves in damage control mode. Fox News barely covered the story. Talk radio hosts who had planned to spend hours mocking Mamdani suddenly found other topics to discuss. Progressive media, meanwhile, couldn't get enough of the story. MSNBC played the clip repeatedly. Liberal commentators called it one of the most effective political responses they'd ever seen. Late-night comedians had a field day. The internet meme machine went into overdrive. Images of Scott's shocked expression became instant classics. GIFs of him sitting speechless were shared millions of times. The phrase, "That's what real hypocrisy looks like," became a rallying cry for progressives. But it wasn't just social media users who were impressed. Political professionals from both parties recognized what they'd witnessed. Democratic operatives called it a masterclass in political communication. Even some Republicans privately admitted that Mamdani had outmaneuvered Scott brilliantly. For progressive causes and candidates, the clip became a fundraising goldmine. Organizations that had struggled to raise money suddenly found their donation pages crashing from traffic. Mamdani's own political operations saw contributions pour in from across the country. To understand why Mamdani's response was so devastatingly effective, you have to look at the strategy behind it. This wasn't just a spontaneous moment of brilliance. It was a carefully crafted political takedown. First, Mamdani had clearly done his homework on Scott. He knew Scott's background, his voting record, his public statements about poverty and opportunity. When Scott attacked him personally, Mamdani was ready with a response that was both personal and political. Second, Mamdani managed to claim the moral high ground while delivering a devastating attack. He didn't deny his privilege. Instead, he owned it and used it to highlight Scott's hypocrisy. This made it impossible for Scott to counterattack without looking even worse. Third, Mamdani connected his personal attack to broader policy issues. This wasn't just about two politicians trading insults. It was about the fundamental question of how America should address poverty and inequality. Fourth, every word of Mamdani's response was perfectly chosen. He didn't use inflammatory language or personal insults. Instead, he let the facts speak for themselves, making his attack seem reasonable and measured rather than angry or petty. Finally, Mamdani's timing and delivery were flawless. The pause before he responded built tension. His calm tone made his words more powerful, not less. And his decision to end with a simple, clear statement, "That's what real hypocrisy looks like," gave the moment perfect closure. What made this moment so brilliant from a strategic perspective was that Mamdani had turned Scott's attack into a trap. By getting personal, Scott had opened himself up to the exact kind of response that would be most damaging to his political brand. In the weeks and months following the hearing, Tim Scott found himself dealing with the long-term consequences of his failed attack. His reputation as a skilled political communicator took a significant hit. Political observers began to question whether he was ready for the national stage. Scott's presidential ambitions, which had been building momentum, suddenly stalled. Donors began to express concerns. Political operatives started looking at other potential candidates. The man who had been seen as a rising star in the Republican Party suddenly looked like damaged goods. Perhaps most damaging, Mamdani's characterization of Scott as hypocritical began to stick. Progressive groups started using Scott's own words against him, highlighting the contrast between his personal story and his political positions. The narrative became impossible for Scott to shake. Meanwhile, Mamdani found himself catapulted to national prominence. Speaking requests poured in. National media outlets wanted interviews. Progressive donors who had never heard of him suddenly wanted to fund his future campaigns. The clip also had real policy implications. Democratic politicians across the country began using Mamdani's argument about privilege and responsibility. The conversation about poverty and opportunity shifted in ways that favored progressive positions. For political operatives and communications professionals, the exchange became a case study in how to handle political attacks. Mamdani's response was analyzed in political science classes and campaign training sessions. Beyond politics, the moment became part of the broader cultural conversation about privilege, hypocrisy, and responsibility. It was referenced in everything, from academic papers to comedy sketches to social media debates. Mamdani's successful counterattack represented something larger than just one political moment. It demonstrated how authentic, well-researched communication could cut through political spin and connect with audiences in the social media age. The response to the exchange also highlighted generational divides in American politics. Younger voters who had grown up with social media and were skeptical of traditional political messaging were particularly receptive to Mamdani's direct approach. Political analysts began to recognize that voters were increasingly rewarding politicians who seemed authentic and penalizing those who seemed scripted or fake. Mamdani's success suggested that the era of carefully managed political communications might be ending. For political operatives, the exchange demonstrated the importance of thorough research and preparation. Scott's attack failed because he hadn't adequately prepared for how Mamdani might respond. In the information age, politicians who don't do their homework get exposed. The moment also served as a warning about the risks of personal attacks in politics. Scott's decision to get personal opened him up to a devastating counterattack. Politicians across the spectrum took note of how quickly a personal attack could backfire. Finally, the exchange showed the power of political narrative. Mamdani didn't just respond to Scott's attack. He reframed the entire conversation around the question of who is really being hypocritical. That narrative shift was what made his response so devastating. Today, more than a year after that fateful hearing, the impact of those few minutes continues to reverberate through American politics. Tim Scott never fully recovered from the exchange. and his presidential ambitions remain stalled. Mamdani's trajectory, Zohran Mamdani, meanwhile, has used his moment in the spotlight to build a national platform for progressive politics. He's become one of the most sought-after speakers on the left, and speculation about his own future runs for higher office continues to grow. The exchange taught important lessons about political communication in the modern era. Authenticity beats polish, preparation beats assumptions, and personal attacks can backfire spectacularly when they're not properly thought through. More broadly, the moment represented a shift in American political discourse. Voters are increasingly hungry for politicians who will speak directly about difficult issues, even when it makes other politicians uncomfortable. The themes Mamdani raised in his response about privilege, responsibility, and hypocrisy continue to resonate in American political debates. His argument that those who have been helped should help others has become a central part of progressive political messaging out in the end. Tim Scott learned a hard lesson about political combat in the social media age. When you come for someone, you better be prepared for them to come back harder. And when you attack someone's character, you better make sure your own character can withstand scrutiny. What started as Scott's attempt to score political points against a young progressive turned into one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent memory. It showed that in politics, as in life, sometimes the person who thinks they're the hunter can quickly become the hunted. What do you think? Was Mamdani's response as devastating as it seemed? Or do you think Scott will recover from this political embarrassment? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown of one of the most brutal political exchanges of recent years, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more political analysis and viral moments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll break down another moment when political calculations went horribly wrong.